In the span of just over a century, cruel practices that had been a part of civilization for millennia were suddenly abolished. The killing of witches, the torture of prisoners, the persecution of heretics, the execution of nonconformists, and the enslavement of foreigners, all carried out with stomach-turning cruelty, quickly passed from the unexceptionable to the unthinkable. The reaction to suffering in other living things has changed. Most people today have no desire to watch a cat burned to death, let alone a man or a woman. In that regard, we are different from our ancestors of a few centuries ago, who approved, carried out, and even savored the infliction of unspeakable agony on other living beings.
I listened to various reviews of various Russian scientists on your book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And very often I heard, this is an incredibly interesting book, but it looks like it was not written about us. It's as if Russia wasn't taken into account here at all. And the second point, quite recently I recorded an interview with Robert Sapolsky, I guess you've heard of him, and we were just recording our conversation about aggression, how much more it has grown. It has been in us since the times of apes. It has been in us since the time of apes, and so on and so forth. And of course I asked about you and your book, and what he thinks about it, because he claims that there is more aggression, and you claim that it has declined. And he told me pretty much the same, that you, being a white cisgender man living in a very democratic country, describe the circle you exist in as if other countries did not exist. And I just wanted to ask you, do you understand that you kind of overlooked the rest of the world in your scientific research?
The Better Angels of Our Nature and the next book, Enlightenment Now, they were graphs from the whole world. So the rate of death from war went down. In fact, in the period since 1945, which is the period in which war deaths went down, it wasn't because there were fewer wars among white countries dominated by white people, but rather the horribly destructive wars in other parts of the world were reduced. Some of the terrible wars include the War of Indian Independence in 1947, the Bangladesh War of Independence in 1971, the Vietnam War, wars in Latin America, wars in Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Uganda. The rates of death from war in all of those countries went down. No, that's absolutely wrong. At least since, aside from the difference between World War II and after World War II, and that was a huge difference. But then after World War II, it kept going down, and that was not a phenomenon of white rich countries. It was a global phenomenon.
Pinker, as a fan of comparing and categorizing everything, describes his 5 factors in humanizing humanity. The author calls them historical forces. So, the level of violence began to decline because, having intended exchange and trade, people began to get to know each other. Then they began to travel, saw their neighbors, and realized that the world abroad was not so scary. The collective moral sense developed, and women all over the world began to fight for their rights. And yet, Pinker considers the state to be the main historical force of humanization. Russians and Belarusians will probably disagree. That very Leviathan, which abolished anarchy and abandoned the principle of an eye for an eye. And again, not everyone is ready to agree with this.
Archaeologists tell us that humans lived in a state of anarchy until the emergence of civilization some 5,000 years ago, when sedentary farmers first coalesced into cities and states and developed the first governments. Before the advent of civilization, when men lived without a common power to keep them all in awe, their lives should have been nastier, more brutish, and shorter than when peace was imposed on them by armed authorities, a development I will call the pacification process.
I want to understand the historical forces you write about in your book, which, as you say, at one time helped prevent a lot of violence. That is, there has been less violence because of these forces. The first thing you write about is Leviathan, the state, and as soon as we got the police and some laws, there's been less violence.
Now, of course, within a country, the Leviathan would be the government, the police, the courts, the bureaucracy. And there, in terms of the Leviathan reducing violence, the way I think of it is there's always a trade-off between how much the government prevents people from killing each other and how much the government itself is a threat to people.
Do you have any prediction about what will happen to states after war? Because the number of people who shot a person and killed a person will increase greatly. I'm afraid to imagine the number of people who will get used to killing and for whom it will become the norm during this hopefully short period. What will happen to the state? How much will the level of violence increase, or will things return to normal?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's no easy, automatic, obvious answer. It is true sometimes that after a war, soldiers come home, they're used to killing, and the crime rate can go up, but much depends on how effective the policing is in the country. That if soldiers come home to anarchy at home, then that can be dangerous. If they come home and there's still enforcement of the laws, punishment of violent criminals, that can keep the rate down. In the United States, there was in many Western countries, there was a big increase in crime starting in the 1960s until the early 1990s. And then in the United States, it went way down. It's come up a little bit since, but the crime rate fell by more than 50%. And that's after Vietnam, after the Gulf War that pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So it isn't necessarily true that returning soldiers increased the crime rate. It very much depends on how effective the policing. And also, another factor is harder to measure. There's some reason to think that people's trust in their government, trust in their fellow members of society has a role in the crime rate. When people have a high degree of trust, when they think the government represents me, the government is competent, the government is on the right side, I can trust most of my neighbors, that tends to lower the crime rate. And when people think everything is corrupt, then I may as well steal before other people steal from me. That's when the crime rate can go up. Again, it's relevant to the era after the collapse of the Soviet Union government, where there was tremendous cynicism and distrust, and no one had any faith in the government or their fellow citizens.
When you were writing your book, did you have any data about what exactly helps reduce this amount of violence after war? Because when I interviewed people in Russia who returned from the Afghan war, from the Chechen war, they told me that our state in no way provided any help. No psychological assistance. I don't know about America, but in Russia, the Afghan syndrome still exists. And if you say, oh, he was in Chechnya, we will immediately understand what we are talking about. Is there any good example of a state that after war somehow tried to reduce quickly and sharply this increase in violence?
It's a very good question, and I don't know the data. That's just my own ignorance, but it's an issue in the United States as well. It arose when many soldiers came back from Vietnam, and then again, the veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think that the counseling and therapy can be effective for the sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are, of course, many coming back from wars who suffer from that. And I suspect there are studies. I just don't know of them. I would think just morally, any country that asks its young people to put themselves in danger, to kill and take a chance at being killed or being injured, seeing horrors, does have a responsibility when they come back to help them overcome trauma and to reintegrate in society. That should obviously be part of the bargain of someone serving in the military.
The idea that an exchange of benefits can turn zero-sum warfare into positive-sum mutual profit was one of the key ideas of the Enlightenment, and it was revived in modern biology as an explanation of how cooperation among non-relatives evolved. It changes the pacifist's dilemma by sweetening the outcome of mutual pacifism with the mutual gains of exchange. Though gentle commerce does not eliminate the disaster of being defeated in an attack, it eliminates the adversary's incentive to attack, since he benefits from peaceful exchange too, and so takes that worry off the table.
Commerce. You say it helps in the fight against violence. It is known that Russia and Ukraine were great trading partners. Even after 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, they were in each other's top 5. Since the beginning of the war, despite the fact that here it is, the war has begun, Ukraine continued to maintain the gas flow. Can we say that commerce has somehow ceased to restrain violence? It doesn't solve anything.
Well, it certainly did not, it wasn't enough to deter Putin, but what it does mean is that when countries are economically interconnected, that it makes it disadvantageous. It makes it harmful to engage in war. That is, you're punished, and of course, Russia is being punished by the sanctions, the isolation. Now, the threat of punishment isn't always enough to deter people. We know this because we have fines for speeding in traffic. We've got laws against rape and murder, but people still drive over the speed limit. People still park in illegal places. Some people still commit rape and murder. The question is, what would the world be like if there was not international commerce and dependency? Would it be far worse? I mean, what we have in Putin is someone who is willing to suffer the punishments of economic sanctions. So it means you're right that it certainly did not work in this case, but the reason it didn't work is you had someone who was willing to make his country poorer in order to satisfy his vision of historical greatness or reversing historical injustices and humiliations. People are complicated. They have many different motives. Most of the time, most people would rather be richer than poorer, but we all make sacrifices of money for other things in life, and you can have a leader who thinks it's okay for the country to be poorer, to sacrifice wealth in order to achieve greatness or justice. Now, the problem, of course, is when you don't have a real democracy, the people don't get to make that choice. It's the leader who makes that choice. But what we're seeing, I think, is a system in which the commercial interdependence is a force that pushes back against war and conquest, but not 100% of the time. It's not foolproof. It really depends on how much countries or leaders of countries and the people, if they're asked, value being affluent as opposed to carrying out historic dreams. I think we have a lot of moralistic discourse that demonizes the desire to be rich, the desire for material comfort. It says we should look for higher, more glorious, more cosmic goods. But I actually think there's a lot of good in people prioritizing their own material situation, having a house over their head, having enough food to eat, being able to travel, being able to afford health care. If people prioritize that kind of wealth which comes from commerce, we're all better off than if they think, well, I'll sacrifice that for salvation or glory or justice. Now, one other thing, though, has to be added to the idea that commerce is a civilizing force. This is an idea that goes back to the Enlightenment. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers advanced the idea that free trade, commerce, economic exchange made people more cooperative, made people more peaceful. And that is that countries, there's a general correlation. Countries that get rich by trade and commerce and business, and therefore they're affluent, are usually better off in many, many indicators of well-being than countries that get rich because they dig up minerals from the ground. So if you can, there's a strong correlation over countries between general measures of social progress. How long do people live? How healthy are they? How well do their children do in school? How much do people want to move into that country as opposed to out of that country? Everything that makes the country good. Now that correlates with affluence, GDP per capita, but not perfectly. And so if you imagine a curve where there are poor countries where you really don't want to live and rich countries that are very nice places to live, like Denmark and New Zealand, Canada, there are some countries that are rich but not very pleasant. And those are often the Arab Gulf states. The reason is they got rich just by digging stuff out of the ground or pumping stuff out of the ground. And that means that a small elite benefits from those resources, but there's not a set of habits and norms that spread throughout the society that make people take each other's interests into account. So you can compare on the opposite extreme, a country like Singapore or Hong Kong or Belgium or Israel, where they aren't blessed with lots of minerals, or diamonds and oil, but they are both rich and nice places to live because it's based on commerce and exchange. Now, you know where I'm going to take this, and that is that Russia increasingly has derived its wealth from oil and gas and coal. And so Russia is kind of in the direction of some of the Arab oil states, some of the African countries like Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, where their wealth comes from minerals as opposed to networks of exchange. And I think it has gone to Russia's disadvantage that it's become a petrochemical state instead of a state of technology and commerce and business and investment and exchange.
But in this case, what can you say about the trade war between China and the USA? This is also commerce, but is it already reaching unhealthy proportions?
Well, yes, no, it's a good illustration. In China, during the 40 years in which it's become richer and richer and richer, it has fought hardly any wars. The United States has fought more wars than China. China had a war with Vietnam in 1979, a very short war. But China has, during its economic rise, it stayed out of wars. Now, a little bit like Putin, we have a leader in China who seems to be willing to sacrifice some economic growth for dreams of historical justice. Now, let's hope he doesn't go that far and invade Taiwan. But it's often been said that the reason that China and the United States until now, and China and all of its neighbors have not fought wars, is it would be disastrous for China's economy because they depend on exports. And so that has kept them away from war. Now, again, that might change because it is a question, does Xi Jinping willing to make China poorer, more chaotic, more isolated in order to claim that Taiwan and is part of China after all? I hope not. It's possible. And if so, though, he would absolutely be sacrificing the health of China's economy. And he knows that, and that maybe, I suspect that will be the main reason that he does not invade Taiwan.
Today, the Enlightenment is often mentioned with a sneer. Critical theorists on the left blame it for the disasters of the 20th century. The conservatives of the Vatican and the American intellectual right long to replace its tolerant secularism with the alleged moral clarity of medieval Catholicism. Even many moderate secular writers disparage the Enlightenment as the revenge of the nerds, the naive faith that humans are a race of pointy-eared rational actors. This colossal amnesia and ingratitude is possible because of the natural whitewashing of history. The reality behind the atrocities of yesteryear is consigned to the memory hole and is remembered only in bland idioms and icons.
Cosmopolitanism. You also talk about how it reduces violence, that the more you study, the more educated you are, the more you travel, the less you want to conquer other countries. But Russia is a country with a huge percentage of people with higher education. And yet today in Russia, the majority still supports aggression against Ukraine. When did cosmopolitanism stop working?
Yes, well, I don't know if it stopped working on average, but it wasn't enough in Russia. Well, it's hard to tell in Russia because, of course, we don't know the degree of opinion in Russia because people speaking out have to fear that they will be imprisoned. And I don't know if we have accurate opinion polls in Russia. You would, of course, know that much better than me. Nor do we know how that degree of support versus opposition correlates with education. Although, again, you may know the answer. Is it, if there are opinion polls that can be trusted in Russia, does support for the war vary with degree of education? I would guess that people with more education, on average, are less supportive of Putin in the war, but that's just a guess. I don't want to make up data. So that is the question, but you're right that it is not a guarantee. So I will certainly concede that it is possible for people to travel, to be educated, and still want to avenge historic injustices. I think it's less likely, but it is certainly possible. Just an example, in World War II, in Canada, where I grew up in the United States, the hatred of Japan was just absolutely intense. I got this from my mother, who I was born way after World War II, but my mother lived through it. And she said, when she grew up in Canada, the Germans were criminals, they were gangsters, but the Japanese were subhuman. They were like a different race, a different species. And we know from the United States and England and Canada, there were grotesque caricatures of Japanese with big buck teeth, and they were considered to be subhuman, which I think is one of the reasons why in the United States and Canada, the Japanese were rounded up and kept in concentration camps. Why I think there was an easy decision to use the atom bomb by Truman in 1945. Now when you have so much more immigration, so much more mixing, so much more travel, I suspect that would be less likely. I mean, there can still be wars, there can still be demonization, but when you actually know people from a different race, a different culture, it's harder to think of them as less than human.
You're right about the escalator of reason, but neither at the level of the leaders of the countries, Russia and Ukraine, nor at the level of combat units, I'm talking about revenge for those killed, including the murders of civilians. It is impossible to interrupt these cycles of violence. Why do you think it happens? Why doesn't this escalator of reason work?
Yes, well, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I'm interested in human intelligence, human rationality. I just wrote a book called Rationality. Has not been translated into Russian yet, but I think it will be.
The same.
And so it's a question that's very much on my mind. It is the escalator reason says that war is really kind of a stupid thing to do, and it really does not get you what you want. And of course, when you think in terms of game theory, that is the branch of mathematics on what is the rational thing to do when the outcome depends on what other rational agents are trying to do. If you think it through, you realize, well, we might want to steal in conquering resources through war, but so does our enemy. And it's good for us if we do it. It's good for them if we do it. It's terrible if we both do it. We're better off living in peace than in war. That is ultimately, if you reflect, if you think, if you take the long term, that's one of the reasons why I think war has become less popular. Now, part of reason is you have to be in a community of other people who criticize your ideas. And this is a big conclusion of my book, Rationality, where when I wrote Rationality, one of the big puzzles was human beings, Homo sapiens, our species, has on the one hand been able to go to the moon. We developed antibiotics and COVID vaccines and computers and smartphones. We telescopes that give us pictures of distant galaxies. We're in some ways a brilliant species. At the same time, we're an incredibly stupid species. You have people who believe in astrology and conspiracy theories and spiritual energy in crystals. So how can the same species both be so brilliant and so stupid? And part of the answer is we can be brilliant when we join communities where the communities have truth and objectivity as their goal, and crucially, they get to criticize one another. You propose an idea, someone else can say what's wrong with it. And the reason that makes us smarter as a group than any of us as individually is we all have biases and fallacies where we always think that we're right. And of course, we can't always be right. No one is omniscient, no one is perfect, no one is an angel. But we're very good at pointing out what's wrong with the other person's reasoning. We're much better critics of other people than of ourselves. Well, if you have a community, a society, an organization, an institution where people can attack each other's ideas, then gradually the truth can emerge. That's the way science works. In science, it's not just that you've got a scientific genius who figures everything out. The scientist tries to publish their idea. It has to be reviewed by fellow scientists. Even when it's published, other scientists can criticize it. And even Einstein had a lot of wrong ideas, and other scientists pointed them out. Now, when you have a bubble where you have a strong man, and the strong man's opinions count, and it's a crime to criticize the strong man, that is a guaranteed way of being stupid. Even if the strong man has a high IQ, just because no one is that smart. And we depend on communities of debate, of criticism, of free speech, of freedom of the press, of editing, of fact-checking, of looking things up. That's the only way our species has been able to do anything intelligent. And when you have a closed society, when you have a dictator, they almost always end up in disaster, just because they trust their own intelligence, and no one should trust their own intelligence. And of course, you know all of this better than I do, but it is notorious that Putin cut himself off from criticism. He just had a very tiny circle of advisors, and he didn't even necessarily listen to them. But in Russia, because of the way he clamp down on freedom of the press, freedom of expression. If someone offered a criticism, they go to jail or they get poisoned. And the opposition leaders get put in jail, or again, I don't have to tell you or the listeners about all of this, but that is a recipe, that's a guarantee, that's an algorithm for doing stupid things.
The gender gaps in overconfidence, personal violence, and group-against-group hostility raise a frequently asked question. Would the world be more peaceful if women were in charge? The question is just as interesting if the tense and mood are changed. Has the world become more peaceful because women are more in charge? And will the world become more peaceful when women are even more in charge? The answer to all three, I think, is a qualified yes.
The last thing about historical forces is feminism. You say that the more power women have, the less violence there is. Nevertheless, nowadays it has been proven that today women suffer in the same way in the occupation territories as they did before. Why doesn't feminism help in any way? I immediately think of the protests in Belarus taking place some years ago, if you followed it. The protest leaders were women there, and the women came out in white dresses so as not to be harmed. And this also did not work. And there was also a lot of violence. Do you have any assumptions about what will happen to this women's issue after the war? And why doesn't it help anyone today?
In some ways, these are exceptions that prove the rule, namely that women tend to be more on the side of peace, on average, not always, not every one of them. But of course, the power of women in Belarus, in Russia, is less than it would be in countries like Scandinavia, the Baltics, New Zealand. And so it may not be a coincidence that there were these very stupid policy toward war in a country, Russia, in which women don't have as much political power as they do in Western countries. Now, there's no guarantee. Could there have been a female Putin? If there was a female president of Russia, could she have invaded Ukraine and embarked on this disastrous war? Well, maybe. There's no guarantee. I think it's less likely. And there are data that suggest that in general, women are more likely to support the less warlike candidate in democratic elections. The exception is often the entire country is unified behind a war, especially if it's perceived to be a domestic war, and then you don't have much of a sex difference. In Israel, historically, there has not been a big sex difference as there has been in the United States. And it's partly because in Israel, wars are considered more existential. They're not optional the way many of the American wars have been. But in general, this is true of all sex differences between men and women. First of all, whenever there's a difference, there's also overlap. It may be that the average man is more has more of one trait than the average woman, but there's still many women who are more of anything than the average man, and vice versa. So women in general are more pacifistic, but many women are more warlike than the average man, and vice versa. So first of all, there's overlap, and also anyone's actual decision, anyone's actual behavior in a particular circumstance also depends on the specifics of that circumstance. So a woman leader in a world of male leaders, no matter what she privately believes, whatever her emotion is, she's still got to play the same game that everyone else is playing. And so her own tendencies, her own emotions may be irrelevant. If she's a good leader, she plays them by the rules of the game that she's in, including the rules set by the other world leaders. And and that's why you can have women who, of course, lead their countries in war if their country is threatened. But on average, especially when there's collective action, when there's structures in society that make women more powerful overall, not just like one woman in a world of men, but many women who shape the policy, then I think there is a movement away from war. Again, not always, and not when there is a genuine external threat, but certainly especially in terms of sacrificing the material reality of living, education, health, child welfare, lifespan, as opposed to glory, justice, the sides of history. There, I think women are more, on average, care more about living, about life, and less about these abstractions like glory or historical destiny.
The state of peace among men living side by side is not the natural state. The natural state is one of war. A state of peace, therefore, must be established. As Kant believed, the first condition for perpetual peace is that states should be democratic. In an autocracy, a declaration of war is the easiest thing in the world to decide upon, because war does not require of the ruler, who is the proprietor and not a member of the state, the least sacrifice of the pleasures of his table, the chase, his country houses, his court functions, and the like. He may therefore resolve on war as on a pleasure party for the most trivial reasons. But if the citizens are in charge, they will think twice about wasting their own money and blood on a foolish foreign adventure.
Watching world politics, I understand that more and more people in different countries are choosing very conservative right-wing parties, national, far-right. Doesn't this mean that the whole world seems to have turned backwards? Your book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, was written 10 years ago. Don't you think that during these 10 years, the world somehow began to return to the past, just like Putin?
There is some movement backward in that the democracy, which had been increasing quite dramatically for several decades, has now started to go a little bit backwards. So it's erased several decades of progress with the changes that we've seen in India and Hungary and Turkey and, of course, Russia itself. It has not taken us back to the era when I was a student in the 1970s. The world had only 33 democracies, when all of Eastern Europe was part of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Empire, living under communist totalitarian dictatorships, when most of Latin America was under the control of military dictatorships, when Portugal and Spain were literally fascist dictatorships. When I was a student, it wasn't like we call people we don't like fascists. They really were fascist. Greece was under the control of a military junta, the colonels. South Korea and Taiwan were dictatorships. So it's not as bad as it was in the 70s, but it was the high point was about 10 years ago for democracy, and we've definitely gone back somewhat, at least in democracy. And I think of democracy as a way of trying to get the best possible balance between the violence of anarchy on the one hand and the violence of tyranny, of dictatorship on the other. And of course, Russia went through that experience quite recently in the last couple of decades. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the Yeltsin era, the crime shot up through the roof. There was high rates of homicide and other disorder in Russia. And I think the Russian people were tired of the violence of anarchy. They said, okay to the violence of tyranny. And in general, I think when people are given the choice, they'll prefer a strong leader, even a predatory leader, to chaos and anarchy. Now, I think history shows those are not the only two alternatives. You can have a democratic government that does its best to bring about safety and peace and law and order within the country without the government itself being a threat against its people. But Russia isn't there yet. It went from the violence of anarchy to the violence of tyranny. I think that's one of the reasons that Putin has some of the popularity that he has, is that the country is safer than it was during the Yeltsin years.
You talk about the media, and you probably know what has happened in Russia recently. The majority of the audience had been absorbing propaganda for years, despite the free press that appeared on the internet. Now we can say that we didn't manage to overcome the official media. Our voice sounded much quieter despite our millions of views on the internet and our large number of viewers. And more, I think that, damn it, I'm going against the majority. I'm imposing some kind of liberal point of view of mine, but here in my country no one needs it. And maybe it's time to go another way and choose another way because you are in the minority. In general, do you think those liberal values, the values of democracy which you write and talk about so much, maybe they are not suitable for everyone? They're not universal?
Yeah, I mean, well, clearly there are countries that are not as susceptible to liberal ideas. In the Middle East, and of course, to a large extent in Russia. The question is there any reason for long-term optimism, long-term expectation that liberal ideas will be appealing? I mean, there is some in that the world is getting more connected, and that can't be stopped. The countries get more affluent, and as people get more affluent, countries get more affluent, they tend to become more liberal, at least if the affluence comes from networks of trade, commerce, exchange. Again, if the affluence comes from just digging stuff out of the ground, not as true. But it's going to be less, especially with the efforts against climate change, getting wealth from petroleum is going to be less and less viable, and countries are going to face pressure to become better educated, better connected, more plugged into the global economy. All of that, and sheer affluence. I think I mentioned countries that get richer tend to get more liberal, which is why the most liberal and progressive countries like Norway and Sweden and New Zealand and Canada tend to be rich countries. So and because just of the nature of technology, the fact that it's easier to travel, that some of our biggest problems are global problems, such as pandemics, such as the benefits of trade, such as international terrorism and piracy, such as corporates hiding money in offshore shelters. Many of these are going to require that countries cooperate. It's going to require that citizens be exchanged. So these are long-term forces that I think push toward liberalism. And since no historical force is inevitable, it's all just people behaving. And there are 8 billion people, they're going to behave in all kinds of ways. So there's no force of history, but there are some things, some parts of reality that are always parts of reality. And one of them is the fact that knowledge is, that truth is, as one writer put it, that it doesn't go away even if you stop believing in it. That there are certain features of reality that will always be features of reality. And one of them is, we talked about this earlier, that dictatorships, autocracies, closed societies have a built-in disadvantage, that they will be inevitably do stupid things because no leader is infinitely brilliant. We even see this in China. Up to last year, people were saying, well, the Chinese way, that's the future, because they don't have to deal with all these pesky people with their opinions and arguments and disagreeing. They can just implement the best solution from the top down, and the experts know what's good for the society. And so the future is not with democracy, the future is with enlightened dictatorship. Well, now China is not looking so good in that regard. Their economy is doing terribly. They have a stupid COVID policy that people hate. There's corruption, there's misinvestment. And we're seeing in the fate of China, which is still a poor country, that there are advantages to an open society with an exchange of information. And that has certainly been shown in Russia, where the isolation of the leadership, where the choking off of the flow of information has been a disaster. It's a reminder of why open societies, freedom of expression, democracies do have a built-in advantage.
0 is the number of developed countries that have expanded their territory since the late 1940s by conquering another country. No more Poland getting wiped off the map, or Britain adding India to its empire, or Austria helping itself to the odd Balkan nation. Two entire categories of war, the imperial war to acquire colonies and the colonial war to keep them, no longer exist.
Stephen, in one of your interviews, you call Vladimir Putin and his policies anachronism. Ekaterina Shulman, who is a scientific editor of your book The Better Angels of Our Nature in Russia, said pretty much the same thing. Until recently, she's been also saying that Putin is not at war with Ukraine, but with modernity. Why do you think so? On what grounds do you base this assumption?
Most obviously, Putin has gone against this big change in the international system that was 77 years old. Well, first of all, quite literally, the world in 1945 declared war illegal. That is, members of the United Nations cannot engage in aggression without the approval of the Security Council or in self-defense. Now, this is a big change in human history because for most of history, if a nation had a grievance against another nation, it could declare war, capture territory, and crucially, the rest of the world would recognize the conquest. That was true of the United States when it declared war on Mexico in the 1850s, and a good part of the United States now, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, were stolen from Mexico, and the world acknowledged that conquest. We don't live in that world anymore. As of 1945, the world's countries declared that conquest was not to be recognized. And indeed, of course, the vast majority of nations condemned the Russian invasion. And since 1945, there has been a big decline in the number of wars between nations and the amount of territory that has been conquered. Here, it's not the world, it's Putin, because the process of one country, the uniformed army of one country facing the uniformed army of another country, that has definitely gone down, and there was no sign of it becoming more popular. Prior to Putin's invasion, the last major war between two countries was the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was very different, of course, from the invasion of Ukraine. Well, the other change, that's simply a legal change in the world's legal regime, the laws that we live under. But it's part of a historical change where the well-being of individual men, women, and children, their life, their happiness, their health, is the paramount moral good. And governments are just tools, means to the end of making people's lives better. That's the general change in the world's moral system over at least since the Enlightenment. It's been gradual, it's been uneven. Not all countries have gone in that direction, but the world has gone in that direction with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with the advance of other global institutions like the United Nations, with the desire to avoid war, investment in global health, in expanding education, in putting as our top goal just people living their lives, longer lives, healthier lives, happier lives. Now that might seem obvious. You say, well, of course, what else? What other moral value is there? Well, if you think that, then you are a child of modernity, because for much of human history, the greatest good was salvation in an afterlife, or bringing God's law down to earth, or the glory of the civilization, or the race, or the religion. And Putin is very much in that older value system, where the glory of Russian civilization, where undoing historical insults, grievances, injustices, humiliations is worth killing people, destroying their schools, their bridges, their hospitals, their apartment buildings. It's a value system that more and more of the world finds repugnant. That is, in order to restore the greatness of Russian civilization, to carry out some crazy scheme that Ukraine really is the same country as Russia. And for that, it's worth killing people and forcing them to leave their homes and bombing their hospitals and schools. It is a, for a growing number of people, this is a repugnant equation. But Putin still is in the mindset of previous centuries in which leaders thought that way.
Is it possible to say that Putin stopped the world process, or rather, can it be said that Putin stopped the world progress when he started this war? I mean, the world progress in normal international relations, within the framework of which we have long abandoned the idea that we will conquer other territories with the help of weapons.
It's too soon to tell, but I think more likely he's just seen as a criminal who has violated a set of norms that's still in force, but any set of laws will be defied by certain criminals. A country has a law against murder, there's still murderers. The reason that I say that is, first of all, just because except for allies who just don't want to alienate Putin, like India and China, still the vast majority of countries condemned it. In the General Assembly, the vast majority of many countries have cut off trade, refused to cooperate, and if they draw any lessons from Putin's invasion, the lessons are not going to be, hey, invasion's a great idea, good for our country. It has been a disaster for the Russian economy. It's been a disaster for certainly the moral reputation of Russia, which is now seen, or at least of Putin's leadership of Russia, which they're now seen as a gang of criminals, of thugs, of gangsters, of mafiosi. It has not been good for the reputation of Russia's military strength. The Russian military is now seen as a bunch of incompetence. It has not succeeded in showing that Putin was right, that the Ukrainians and the Russians are the same people. The Ukrainians have pretty much made it clear that that is categorically wrong. It has not sown division and disagreement within the country of Ukraine. The country is the most united country in the world. It has not sown disagreement and dissension within the West. The West is totally united. It has not stopped the expansion of NATO, quite the opposite. That NATO is going to expand because now countries realize what NATO is for. So every one of Putin's goals has been frustrated, has been stymied. So other countries looking to see, well, is this the new world that we live in? Should we act like Putin? And I think the answer is going to be clearly no.
World government seems like a straightforward extension of the logic of the Leviathan. If a national government with a monopoly on the use of force is the solution to the problem of homicide among individuals and of private and civil wars among factions, isn't a world government with a monopoly on the legitimate use of military force the solution to the problem of wars among nations?
Leviathan can be at two levels. One of them is within a country with the police force and the courts of law and the justice system. And then we ask the question, well, could there be a global Leviathan that keeps countries from attacking each other? And of course, there's no world government. The United Nations is not exactly a world government. It's not a world government. There's no United Nations army. But what we've lived under for the last 77 years is kind of a patchwork of organizations that are certainly not a world government, but they act a little bit like a global Leviathan in that there are, one thing, there are rules that everyone at least agrees to abide by, and if they don't, then there's no international army that will put the leaders in jail. That's not the way the International Criminal Court works. But there are consequences in terms of reputation. That is, you have signed an agreement and you have lied about your willingness to abide by the agreement. That's not the same as breaking a law where you'll be put in jail, but it does have, it's partway there. Likewise, the various organizations that have either condemned Russia, like the General Assembly, or have cut off, have exerted forms of punishment in the sense of international sanctions, kicking Russia out of international organizations. They're kind of a loose, approximate, rough, the best we can have toward a global Leviathan, given that we don't have a world government. And we probably don't want a world government. But that international order of rules, many different treaties, many different international organizations has been a kind of imitation or approximation of a Leviathan.
As for the United Nations and the Security Council, until recently they were considered a great deterrent during aggression of one state against another. But today we see that this tool has stopped working. And more often I ask myself the question, is it possible to find some kind of deterrent for the tyrant?
Because the United Nations has the paradox, at least the Security Council has the paradox that there's veto power by Russia, and so the Security Council can't enforce the United Nations' own declaration that war is illegal, because it's the Security Council which would issue the condemnation. Any condemnation would be vetoed by Russia or by China. So we're kind of stuck. The other part of the paradox, of course, is without the veto power, it's not clear that Russia and China and the United States, for that matter, would agree to them being a Security Council. So that's a built-in flaw in the United Nations. Another built-in flaw is that each country gets an equal vote. Each country gets represented on the committees. And many countries are not democratic. They're corrupt, authoritarian governments. And so the majority of countries, if each country gets one vote as opposed to each person getting one vote, then you can get majorities supporting all kinds of crazy and anti-democratic ideas. And of course, the various votes in the General Assembly against Israel are an example, or the fact that Iran was the head of the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations is almost a bad joke. So that's when I visited the United Nations and I spoke to some people about some of the ridiculous aspects of the United Nations. They say, well, don't blame the UN as an organization, blame the countries. We can't do what the member countries don't want to be done. And so we as an organization are at the mercy of what all the countries that belong to the United Nations do. And there's some, of course, truth to that. The United Nations does do some good things. The fact that there is a agreement to not wage war, I think is a good thing on average, even though, of course, Russia has defied it. But any law, there'll be criminals. There'll be people who just sort of thumb their nose at the law. It's still better to have the law. The United Nations peacekeeping forces have done a lot of good on average, not always. There are some cases where a country just kicks out the peacekeeping forces and then starts a war. Again, that happened, of course, in Israel in 1967. But still, there have been studies that try to show does it work 100% of the time? Does it work 0% of the time? But is it better to have peacekeeping forces than not to have them? And the answer is it is better. And of course, there are United Nations agencies like UNESCO and UNICEF and the Food and Agricultural Organization that have done a lot of good. So should there be continual efforts to reform the United Nations? Or is it hopeless and we need to start something else? There occasionally are suggestions that there be a World Federation of Democracies where you have to, like the European Union, you can't get in unless you meet certain standards of freedom of the press, electoral fairness, equal rights, protection of minorities, and so on, and that there would be some prestige associated with this new federation that would be pressure on other countries who want to join it. The European Union has had that effect to some extent. The entry requirements push countries to not have laws that outlaw homosexuality. They can't be dictatorships. They have to deal with corruption. It's sometimes said that Ukraine's desire to join the European Union might be a good pressure to reduce corruption within that country. So whether a whole new federation or Congress or League of Democracies could supplement the United Nations, it's an interesting idea. I don't know whether it's realistic or not, but I think it is worth talking about.
Yes, because on the one hand, as you say, you cannot interfere in the laws of one country, and people choose them themselves, like North Korea. But when I watched the protests in Belarus, it was obvious that the majority of votes was won by someone else, Tikhanovskaya, not Lukashenko. And this is the will of the people, but no one listens to it. Or what is happening in Russia now? We cannot find out the real number of people who are against the war. I personally don't understand what to do in these cases, and I feel like a child. Well, do something. Some grown man, come and calm down this bully. I don't know, maybe you have your own opinion on this.
Yes, so the flow of information is obviously crucial, and the social media, which are often demonized in the United States and in Europe, originally had the great liberatory role of getting information into closed societies and allowing people to coordinate with one another. Now, of course, governments can be effective at repressing free media, as in China, for example, and in Russia. But it does call for ways of getting around the censorship, getting around the barriers, so that people in a country can tap into the world's knowledge in cases where their own government is repressing the truth. So that's absolutely crucial. The problem, then there's the new problem. This is why social media companies have been so attacked, that when anyone can say anything on social media, how do you distinguish between reliable reporting and fake news or rumors or conspiracy theories? And so the sources that earn trust by their objectivity, their editing, their fact-checking, their willingness to correct errors, it's very important that they gain that reputation, that prestige, that they earn it, that they don't become just ideological mouthpieces, that they continue to maintain standards, so that in all of the noise, the cacophony, the competing rumors, people know which ones to take seriously. But I do hope there are greater methods of getting information into closed societies. I support an organization called the Human Rights Foundation that tries to do that. It gives prizes to human rights advocates in closed societies. There's a campaign to get USB drives into North Korea, since North Korea controlled their internet. But if you could smuggle in the little memory drives with everything from South Korean TV shows to news reports, that's a way of informing the citizens within that country of what's happening outside it. But that's one solution, but there have to be many more. I'll just add also just one big historical change, Irina, that you referred to, is the question of whether national sovereignty is the ultimate and only criterion for for power, for influence. And we do live in a world in which, as much as we valorize national sovereignty, we also recognize international human rights. And this came up during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, in which one argument was, well, the Nazis could only be held accountable for the genocides they committed on Polish soil and Romanian soil, that what they did in Germany, well, they have sovereignty, it's their country. They can do whatever they want. Now that was, after World War II, that was rejected. And that's why we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is that there is national sovereignty, but it does have its limits. No country has the right to massacre its citizens, to imprison people without trial. Now, of course, you can't enforce it because we don't have a global Leviathan, but there can be a regime of norms, of expectations, of cooperation, of what a decent country does that is established by declarations like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are mechanisms like the International Criminal Court that tries to say that even if you commit genocide within your own borders, you can still be put on trial afterwards. They're patchy, they're imperfect, but that is, I think, a direction that the world has been going in.
Sometimes pairs of countries that looked daggers at each other for centuries can turn into good buddies. England and France, England and the United States, Germany and Poland, Germany and France. But the amity comes after decades of coexistence, rather than as the immediate outcome of conciliatory gestures. The psychology of forgiveness, recall, works best when the perpetrator and victim are already bound by kinship, friendship, alliance, or mutual dependence. These and other ties that bind can prepare the way for gestures of apology and reconciliation.